pleased to welcome Guy Hunt from LP Archaeology. Yes, I just noticed on the programme, actually, it's LAP Archaeology. I'm assuming that's a typo, Guy.
I was going to make no comment on that. It's spelled correctly on my ones. I've got my name spelled right as well. I did double check that.
That's the important thing. So Guy from LP Archaeology is going to tell us about the excavations at St Mary's, Stoke Mandeville.
All right, are we off?
Clear and loud. Thank you, Guy. Over to you.
Brilliant. Hello, everybody. I guess that I am here really to take you on a bit of a field trip away from London. So London and Middlesex Archaeological Conference, jump on the special Charabanc and we will go off for a day out in the countryside. So it's a bit of a Londoner's day out in the countryside for you. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that we've been doing on the HS2 project at LP Archaeology. And we've basically been working on a really short stretch of this really long linear project, a little bit of the line, less than 10 kilometres long, just to the south of Aylesbury. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a bit of an introduction to the project and the site and just tell you a bit about some of the stuff that we've done that's kind of a bit different. And then I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of some of the kind of special finds and fancy stuff that we've had that you might have seen in the news, and so I can give you some new news about that as well. So with that, if everybody could jump aboard the Charabanc and we'll set off travelling northwest past Watford and up towards Aylesbury. And this is where we get to. This is the site. Give you a very rough idea on the map there. It doesn't actually indicate where London is, but I didn't have time to go back and argue with the graphics people about that. But it gives you an idea that we're bang in the middle of England. And the site is located just to the north of the Chilterns. So if you've ever been up to Combe Hill, there's a viewpoint up there with a memorial on top. And if you look down from there towards Aylesbury, you would see the site down in the plain below you. And the view that you've got on the left there, the aerial view, you actually see in the near ground. I don't know whether you see my mouse or not, but in the near ground you see the remains of the church as they were excavated in 2018 by us. And looking away into the medium ground, you see the manor house, and beyond that the village of Stoke Mandeville, and in the distance you see Aylesbury itself. And that just gives you a little bit of an idea about the way that the site is situated and so on. So the site of the church is actually isolated in the landscape. It's about a mile away from the location of the modern village. And people have speculated over the years that perhaps it lies at the centre of a deserted medieval village, and that the modern day village is actually a newer construct, as it were. And that's something which we spent quite a bit of time looking at and examining during the project. So we were working here initially in 2018 and right through now up until the end of last year. So we've been about 3 or 4 years involved in this project. And to give you an idea of the overall kind of scale of the main excavation, which we did last year. So we had a team of about 70 on site. We excavated over 3,000 burials. The works which took place inside the big tent that you're seeing here with the field team there took about 6 months. But in a way, they're almost like the culmination of the project. We'd been working for about a year previous to that on all of the open area archaeology around many hectares of archaeological site, covering a whole range of periods. So we've got really interesting later prehistory and the interface that has with the Roman settlement nearby. And then obviously, Jane mentioned this earlier in her introduction, we were really excited about this as a medieval site. So at the very heart of the site is the church itself, and then the churchyard around it. And we're extremely excited to excavate that site and try to understand a little bit about the way that site developed from the medieval period through into this, what effectively is like a deserted church. Other stats and statistics on this, obviously we excavated 3,200 burials, but we also then carefully washed and assessed all of those on site during that period. we recorded around 13,000 archaeological contexts. And we've recovered about 700 plus architectural fragments from the church remains. And I could go on with the kind of technical and archaeological superlatives and statistics for a while longer than that, but it's just really there to give you an impression of the kind of scale of the project. It was a really big undertaking. Quick overview of the archaeological site, as it were. So the church at the heart of the landscape. Now, the image on the left is from the late 19th century, from about the 1860s. And that's just before the church became abandoned. So very briefly, the ecclesiastical history here is that when Stoke Mandeville becomes a parish in its own right, it splits away from Bearton, with which it was a kind of a joined parish, and it gets its own status as a parish. And right at that moment, as soon as they get their own vicar, they basically decide, well, actually, we don't want to be walking a mile down through this boggy landscape to get to this ruinous old church. And they build a new church in the village, which is actually a brick-built replica of this church, or not a replica, but at least it's very similar in scale and form. And then this church effectively just is abandoned and slowly falls into ruin. And by the 60s, it's in a state where it's irreparable and it's deliberately demolished. And what's left in the landscape is a mound of rubble, which becomes slowly overgrown. And a kind of interesting thing for us in process terms here is that when we look at that image of the church, you can see that although there's one big tree at the east end of the church there isn't, in fact, not an awful lot of vegetation in the landscape, and something that when we came to this landscape, the whole area was completely overgrown. And it was actually very hard to read and interpret the site at that point. Now, the site was looked after and known and studied to some degree over many years by lots of different people. So there's all sorts of credit which needs to be given to all sorts of other people here. And I couldn't possibly name check everybody, but the Bucks Archaeological Society had a key role in making sure that this site was conserved, preserved, and making sure that it was properly excavated through the process with HS2. And then on the right, you can see two images there of us actually doing the excavation within the church. The lower image shows the church architecture in its kind of final form, and the upper image is where we've taken away almost everything apart from the early Norman remains, which show it to be quite a small building. And the church, although it's a parish church in its later life, it actually begins life as effectively the chapel of a small manorial complex. I'm not going to do the whole of the medieval archaeology of this site because that demands a talk in its own right. But the really interesting thing here is that actually the site doesn't begin as a DMV. It begins as a moated complex, which later develops into a parish church. And I hope to provoke some questions here. I'm going to leave a bit of time, so fire away on questions if anyone's interested in that side of the site. Then surrounding the church is the whole of this burial ground. And the burial ground excavation here is really different to what you're going to see from Louise later. It's a completely different kind of burial ground, massively intercut. The relatively low numbers of known grave positions and relatively few grave markers. The image, although you can't read all the names, the image on the right just gives you an indication of where the known individuals are in that burial ground. And you can see that it's a handful out of the thousands which are in there. Even the people who had the status to be buried in the church, only a handful of them had monuments, recognizable locations, and so on. So burial ground here presents a different challenge in terms of dating. It's a much longer time frame. So we're talking about burials beginning in, let's say, around 1100 and going on right up to around 1900. So we have around 800 years of burial going on. And then within that, we have very little dating evidence. And in fact, stratigraphically, it's quite complex as well, because although we're talking about clear intercutting relationships, there's quite a broad area. In order to make a sane matrix, we really are going to be relying on some of the scientific dating that we hope to get. In order to do this wonderful excavation, we then obviously had to go out there and build a facility. So I think that this is a really brilliant piece of engineering on the part of HS2 Fusion, and we had some small say in how this work was done. not least that we had to excavate all the archaeology around here in order to build this enormous tent. Now, the tent is striking by its absolutely ginormous size. It's one of the biggest kind of structures I think I've ever been in. But what I wanted to just put this slide on here for is to indicate to you the porter cabin city there over on the right-hand side of the image, because actually, although some of that stuff is welfare and offices and things like that, what I wanted to draw your attention to is the cabins along the edge of that pond there. And that's where we built our linear processing facility. So we were able to take the skeletons that were being excavated in the church under that tent, and we were able to keep on top of a process there whereby we were able to finish the last assessment within a matter of a couple of weeks from the end of the excavation taking place. The pond itself is interesting because that's actually there for water capture. And we spent a lot of time designing the process here. So we actually spent effort, thinking about how this process was going to be done. So thinking about the ergonomics of the way that sinks were developed. We used a kind of restaurant washing tap, for example. We had hot and cold running water. We invested in drying room facilities. We learned from Sander, who's pictured here, had expertise from Park Street, and she was able to give us brilliant advice on how to take that forward. And we also learned from the excavation that Louise is going to talk about at St James's Garden. So as coming last, we had the advantage of being able to benefit from all of that knowledge. The other peculiarity, as it were, of the St Mary's project is that we undertook a really major program of public archaeology. So this was not just a bolt-on, let's do an open day. We actually, and with HS2's blessing and encouragement, we built within the tent a whole museum area, what we called the St Mary's Field Museum. And we wanted to try and create a space which was going to go a little bit beyond just being an exhibition. So it has an exhibition and did function as an exhibition. And we were able to try and cater for that. And you can see we had thousands of visitors, and we would have had more if it wasn't for COVID. But really what we wanted to talk about with this space was that it was actually a space where we were able to bring people in and talk about things like oral histories. We were able to do accredited educational courses. We were able to actually bring members of the public in to a space which was safe within the construction site. So those of you that have worked on construction sites know a lot of the constraints around that. And so we had to create a space which was going to work, where we would be able to bring people in and it would be relatively calm and relaxed. And so members of the Bucks Archaeological Society were able to come in and actually participate in some of the research we were doing, recording graffiti from some of the medieval masonry fragments, that kind of stuff. So it's the idea of the museum as a kind of living space, not just as a sort of static display, as it were. So that whistle-stop view of what we did on our holidays brings me up to really the end of the project. And once we had taken away the church, and in fact, if you look in the background there, you can see our now demolished or taken away field museum space. What we were left with underneath the church was a large circular ring ditch. I'm going to indicate this with my mouse. I don't know if you can see it. If I was in front of a screen, I would walk about waving my hands. But there's a large circular ring ditch there, deeply cut V-shaped thing. And in the center of that, or near to the center of that, there's a big rectangular masonry pad. Now, things being what they are, the project decided that it was going to prove that old adage about things being found at the last minute. And so we did our 10% hand dug slots through that ditch. And then as we were very keen to make sure that we were going to dig 100% of it. And therefore, as we started to take out the remaining fill of that ditch, the final week, we found this stuff. And I placed there for you a picture of a shocked-looking archaeologist, because it's hard to sort of express in a kind of PowerPoint format, but it was an extremely shocking discovery that we made in the ditch there. The kind of thing where, you know, superlatives aren't really adequate to sort of express what you're thinking at the time. And within that ditch, we found this cache of Roman sculpture associated with some other really interesting finds. And I'm just going to spend the remaining kind of 5-10 minutes of the talk here just showing you about some of that stuff and where we're at with that. You've probably seen, well, the images of Cameron there are screen grabbed from his 15 minutes of fame on the BBC. So you may be familiar with some of this stuff, and I'll just bring you up to date with where we are and what we know now. So the sculptures have been taken off to our facility up in Stansted, where they're being very carefully cleaned and conserved. We were very careful to not just scrub them on site. So we wanted to be really, really careful about checking for pigments and paint traces on there. And I can tell you that there were absolutely no traces after all of our careful examination in the lab. No paint survived, so that's a real shame. But what we do now have is a set of very clean, very nice looking Roman sculptures. And I'm no expert on Roman sculptures, so feel free to ask me difficult and controversial questions in the chat afterwards, and I promise to do my best to answer, although I really not my area of expertise. The three people pictured in the image at the top, though, they really are experts in this. And so we had a visit to Stansted from Penny Coombe, Kevin Hayward and Martin Hennig, who also starred in Chris's talk earlier on. And it's their interpretations of these statues and their report on these statues, which is really going to give us the knowledge that will go forward in our reports, at least at this assessment stage anyway. And the preliminary results, really, I suppose, are telling us that what we have here are the busts of a man, a woman, and a child. And so there's a very tempting question to be placed there, which is, could this be a family group? Which would be a really interesting interpretation to make. They're carved from that similar type of Cotswold limestone that we were seeing earlier, I think, in the Alfred statue. And so they're thought to be Romano British in make, as it were, or at least have been made from stone from here. And going a bit beyond that, there's a thought that probably they have some sort of funerary association. And one of the thoughts about that are this leaf motif on this sort of shoulder of the torso, which has parallels with altars, I'm told. So there we go. Statues with a possibly funerary association, probably dating to the late part of the 1st century. So they're quite early as well. Other parallels, there is another similar woman's head from Bath, from a place called Walcott. And then on your left here is a sculpture which was kindly sent to us by an internet friend who, as soon as the press release went out, emailed to say, have you seen this person? It's got exactly the same hairdo. And this is a statue of Sabina from the museum in Ostia Antica. And then the other thing worth throwing into the mix here is the Minories eagle, which is carved from the same stone and actually has a similar kind of context in the sense of being taken from a funerally associated building and thrown into a ditch nearby. Furthermore, on the context, we have this amazing glass vessel, probably a funerary urn, and a whole series of cremations. Those were also thrown into that ditch along with those sculptures. And this little group of coins, now the group of coins are really, really interesting because they were placed inside a little purse or pouch fixed with a bone pin. And they were associated with a skeleton face down in the ditch next to those sculptures, next to these cremation urns, unceremoniously all thrown into that ditch together and covered with rubble. So what stuff don't we know yet for sure? Well, we can't be sure what kind of building those materials were in. So if we would like to say the word mausoleum, and we would like to have, say, a Roman mausoleum, well, we do have this rectangular pad of masonry. Now, this was a very, very thick pad of masonry. And prior to finding the Roman stuff in the ditch, we were actually interpreting it in this way on the right here, which is this beautiful perspex model of an Anglo-Saxon building, which could have stood on that type of pad. So whilst we now have this strong association with the Roman remains in the ditch, we can't yet really date that foundation. Now, it contains some bits of fragments of Roman CBM and some painted wall plaster and stuff like that, but we can't be sure yet what the date of that is, and we're hoping that the scientific dating really comes through for us on that. We're hoping to use a technique where you can use a radiocarbon date on mortar, and hopefully we'll then come away with an understanding of whether this is the pad of a Roman building or something later. And if it's if it's the base foundation of a Roman building, then I think we've got a really strong case for a mausoleum or some kind of reasonably substantial Roman building. And if it comes back later, then we need to think about that. That, of course, raises a whole rake of other questions, which I hope you get round to asking me in the questions. The reaction on these statues are absolutely spectacular, as you probably have, you may have experienced it by looking at some of these things yourself or seeing us on the telly. They tend to focus on, biggest, earliest, greatest, whatever. But the stuff that I think we find really exciting about this, or why do we think these statues are so interesting? I mean, for me, having excavated and stood inside that church, that medieval church, and thinking about the parishioners going about their worship and their daily business over 800 years without even the hint of what they were walking over the top of. I think that that's such a weird and kind of interesting idea. And it makes you wonder what else might be found under parish churches all over Britain, really. Now, just to try and spark some conversation and leave you with some other ideas, I thought I'd give you a few parting thoughts for the trip home. So what do I like about those statues? Other than this idea of them being buried under the church, the hair, I think, is fantastic. The haircut on this female figure is just something really exciting. And I put a picture in here of people doing recreations of first century Roman hairdos, and they are absolutely wild, aren't they? I mean, that is something really spectacular. I don't know whether, for example, I'm not enough of a hair expert to know, but I don't know whether, for example, that whole headdress is actually your own hair or whether they're effectively extensions or what. And the other thing which I think is quite interesting is to just have a thought for future archaeologists and the motives that people have for this kind of destructive thing. So smashing up a statue and throwing it in a ditch is a big thing. It's a thing that humans like to do. And there are all sorts of reasons why people like to pull down or destroy statues. And quite apart from anything, it provides future material for archaeologists. So with that, I will say thank you very much. Enjoy your trip back to London now on the high-speed rail link all the way to Euston. And please ask me some questions.
Thank you very much.